Hi, everybody, and welcome to a new trial site news podcast called Farrago. And I'm Erin, your host, and we're going to bring on a mixed bag of experts to just talk about some of the prevailing topics in science, public health. And our first expert today is Dr. David Ostrov from the University of Florida. So thank you so much for being here, Dr. Ostrov.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aaron. It's such a pleasure to be speaking with you again.
Absolutely. And the TSN audience may remember you. You came on earlier. We did an interview with you about your research that you published in the Internal Journal of Molecular Sciences on how the combination of lactoferrin and diphenhydramine, an antihistamine, which some folks may know, may help with COVID. And you did a study that was done in mice, but I wanted to maybe start there. And if you can give us an update in terms of where you're at with that.
Thank you so much. So just to recap for people that might not be familiar with the history of this project, we early in the pandemic, before there were vaccines, our group adopted the strategy of basically saving the world, trying to find safe, effective drugs that have activity against SARS-CoV-2 that we could put together, where the goal was really to make a combination of safe, effective, stable, economical drugs to generate an antiviral drug combination for prevention and treatment of COVID. That was our intention. And after we published our results, we talked. And after our interview, people contacted me from around the world about this with stories of benefit. People had very interesting stories where they were convinced that this combination of diphenhydramine and lactoferrin actually helped prevent them from getting COVID. Other people had stories of benefit where they believed that it actually helped them recover from COVID, so treatment of COVID. And surprisingly, because we didn't think about this at the time, long COVID, people with long COVID contacted us with stories of benefit. And so since so many people had these stories, you have to think, is this just wishful thinking? Or is there actually some real medical benefit to the combination of diphenhydramine and lactoferrin for long COVID? And the only way we're going to answer that question is with a placebo-controlled clinical trial. And so to bring you up to date with what's happening, we have a long COVID clinic here at the University of Florida, run by a fantastic doctor named Dr. Irina Storez. And we talked about our research and these anecdotal reports. And as a physician, she's strongly interested in understanding whether or not there is a real beneficial effect in a clinical setting of diphenhydramine and lactoferrin. And so she agreed to participate in a placebo-controlled clinical trial to test a regimen consisting of diphenhydramine and lactoferrin in long COVID patients. And to make that happen, we need approval from our institution to be able to conduct a clinical trial. And we asked for permission, and our university said, you need to ask the Food and Drug Administration for permission to conduct this clinical trial. And if the FDA approves, then we will consider approving it at this institution. And so at the moment, the University of Florida has applied for an investigational new drug application to the FDA. And we've gone back and forth several times with the FDA. And fingers crossed, we hope to get approval in the coming weeks so that we can initiate our clinical trial here at the University of Florida.
Well, that's a lot of progress.
Thanks a ton.
Yeah, good for you,
Yes.
Dr. Yeah, that's amazing. Really good things can come of that. So I wish you a lot of luck with that. Absolutely. So on this podcast, like I said, we're calling it Farrago. because it's going to be a mixed bag. I was going to call it mixed bag of nuts, but I thought some people would get offended by that. And I figured I'll ask questions, but I want to let the experts who come on, such as yourself in your fields, do most of the talking and just kind of have a respectful, positive conversation where you can share your point of view and the audience can take it or leave it, apply it to their life as they see fit. So does that sound
Sounds
okay?
great. Absolutely.
All right. So you're an immunologist, you're at the University of Florida, you do research, you're a professor. There's a lot of information out there about the immune system. So hopefully this is not too hard of a task given the time constraint, but can you give us an overview? How does the immune system work?
Yes. So I teach immunology, and my main area of interest in immunology is actually understanding how the immune system tells the difference between what should and should not be destroyed in our bodies. And one way that you can think about the immune system is that you can think of it like an army or like an armed force that has many different components. You know what I mean? We have the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. And we use all of these forces. They have their own area of expertise and they all communicate with each other, right? And that's how our most effective fighting forces are, you know what I mean, when they communicate with each other, when we have these different branches. And you can think about your immune system in a similar manner. Think about what's happening in your blood right now. There are red blood cells, there are white blood cells. The white blood cells in your blood are the main cells that make up this armed force of your immune system. And there are many different types of players in our white blood cells. Some of them are like the Air Force sending long-range laser-guided missiles to very specifically attack their targets. Those are like the B cells floating around in our body. That's what they're like. There are also the troops, like the Marines. Send in the Marines, have them go in directly and kill the target. Those are the killer T cells, the so-called cytotoxic T cells. We also need commanders. We need the generals of the army to decide what should and should not be destroyed in our body. And those generals will make the decision and they'll adopt the best strategy towards defeating the enemy. The generals of the army, those are the helper T cells in our blood. Okay? So the helper T cells are really the deciders of what's good and bad in our body. And they direct the troops and tell them what to do. So that's what's happening in our bodies right now. And what typically happens is that if you get an infection, you know, a bacterial infection or a viral infection, the white blood cells will encounter the virus or bacteria, whatever it is, and they will start to recognize it, and they will start to think about what is the best strategy for defeating this enemy. Is it sending long-range laser-guided weapons to destroy the target? Or is it better to send in the troops and directly kill the target? And typically in our bodies, the immune system is polarized to make this decision. And it either goes one way or the other, either laser-guided long-distance attack or directly sending in the troops by the killer T cells. So that's the main way our immune system functions in terms of combating pathogens that enter our bodies.
I like that. And I wanted to use this podcast to break down some of these complex ideas as much as we can for folks to really grasp and understand. So I really like the analogy of the military. I think a lot of people can relate to that for sure.
Thanks so much. And if people are interested in more details, I can provide them.
All right. All right. So in an email exchange that we had prior to scheduling this podcast, one thing you wrote that stood out to me was that the greatest public misunderstanding about the immune system is the role of antibodies versus T cells. Can you
Yes.
explain that statement?
Yes. So I think it's important to think about the history of immunology. You know, 200 years ago, we didn't have any understanding of what white blood cells were or antibodies and where they came from. But people started to understand about 100 years ago or so. People started to collect blood and allow the blood to clot. And what happens when the blood clot is you get like a reddish purplish layer and a layer of golden serum on top. And people started taking the golden serum layer and injecting it into animals like horses to see what would happen, to see if it would protect them somehow. And they discovered that it did. And so for people, the point that I'm trying to make is that people started to study antibodies before they studied T cells, because people didn't know that T cells existed until roughly the 1950s. So the world knew a lot about antibodies before the world knew about T cells, which we now know are the generals of the army. So because of the history of our deep understanding of antibodies, many medical doctors have been trained much more in antibody biology than T cell biology, actually. And now, is this changing? Are the medical textbooks being updated? Yes, of course. But there is still entrenched in the literature a large body of people that are still stuck on antibodies, and they kind of refuse to accept the fact that the T cells are the generals of the army. And you know, those people are you know, they need to really, I guess, to my way of thinking, they should really adopt this, you know, mindset that almost all antibody responses are dependent on T cells. This is a concept that emerged in the 1970s. Immunologists started to realize that T cells control whether antibodies are made or not. The T cells are the general of the army, not the B cells. The B cells are not the decider. They're dependent on T cells. So, and this concept, you know, started to really take a greater hold in the 1980s when HIV came along, because what HIV does is it attacks the generals of the army, the helper T cells, and kills them. And that makes people not be able to tell the difference between what should not be destroyed in their bodies. And they become immunocompromised and often succumb. And so a large group of scientists around the 1980s kind of shifted their thinking. We need to think of T cells as the generals of the army. And since then, so much new information has come out about T cells and the generals of the army, and how they can not only, you know, tell the other cells what to do when they attack, but to regulate the immune response when things need to be regulated. You know what I mean? We can't have our immune system on all the time. You know what I mean? It has to be
Sure.
on, clear the virus, and then tone itself down.
Sure.
So I think it's very important for the scientific community and the mainstream media to appreciate that T cells are the generals of the army, not B cells. And if you watch TV during COVID, you would think that it's the antibody response that is the only thing we really need to pay attention to. And that's not true. Because remember when we were talking about how the immune system works, and you could either send in the laser-guided weapons or send in the troops. And usually the immune system decides one way's better than the other. Well, if you watch TV during COVID, you would think that the immune system decided that the best way to clear the virus was to send in antibodies. That is not true. We realized fairly early in the pandemic that the deciders in our bodies, they decide that the best way to clear COVID is to send in the troops, not antibodies. In fact, many people clear SARS-CoV-2 from their bodies without making any neutralizing antibodies whatsoever. What does this mean? T cells cleared the virus from their bodies. And in fact, T cells are the main drivers of protection from COVID. This is the main point that I
The
wanted to
main
get
point.
across.
Okay, so just to emphasize, to drive home this point for our listeners, a strong antibody response does not equal a strong immune response. Is that a fair statement to make?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And then as a follow-up to that, what we were seeing in COVID in terms of T cells versus antibody response. Can you just drive home that a little more for our
Yes.
listeners? Okay.
So remember during COVID, we heard a lot about variants and how variants escape recognition by antibodies. That's because the virus figured out that it could trick the antibodies. The virus is trying to confuse the antibody response so that it won't be cleared by antibodies. And consequently, the generals of the army said, hey, these long-range weapons, these laser-guided missiles are not working. We need to send in the troops. We need to send in the cytotoxic T cells to directly kill the enemy. Does that
The T
help?
cells. Yeah, I think the T cells, the generals of the
Yes,
army.
the generals
The
say,
generals.
the virus is confusing the antibody response. These long-range weapons are not working. Therefore, just like the surge in Iraq, remember the surge in Iraq?
Sure
We
do.
need to send in the troops to directly kill our enemy. That's what our immune systems did with COVID.
All right, I'm going to shift to a more general discussion about vaccines. And my approach to talking about vaccines is to meet people where they are and to keep it positive, to listen to people's concerns, and to have experts on, such as yourself, to provide information to people. And, people can sort of sit with that and think about it and apply it to their lives. So from your perspective as an immunologist, what are your thoughts on vaccines? Vaccines important? Vaccines, well, just, share your general perspective here about vaccines, if you will.
Yes, I'm happy to. Yes. So what do vaccines do? What do they actually do? Well, what they do is they train the troops. They train the troops and the generals to recognize the enemy and to prepare the best strategy for attacking the enemy. Okay, so you can think of a vaccine like training the troops. It's like you're getting your body especially prepared so that your body can rapidly respond to the enemy when it is encountered. What happens if you don't get vaccinated? Well, then your body won't have, your immune cells will not have been, won't have had this training. They won't be prepared to immediately attack the invader. So what will happen if you're not vaccinated is that when something comes inside of you, it will grow to a greater extent because it takes time for your immune system to figure out what the best strategy is to recognize and defeat the invader. So, and during that time, the invader will probably be damaging cells inside of your body. So you're at risk of having consequences that you might not have if your immune system was previously trained with a vaccine. So that's my perspective on, what happens if you're vaccinated, what happens if you're not vaccinated.
Okay.
People should realize that humans appreciated the value of vaccines in terms of saving lives a long time ago. Many people I'm sure are aware of this, but for those that aren't, maybe I can share a little bit of history for you about
Absolutely. Love history. Go right ahead.
So in terms of the Western world really became aware of vaccines in the early 1700s. And what happened was that smallpox was a big problem. Smallpox was killing large numbers of people around the world, and it actually had been for, some people think, 10,000 years. But in the early 1700s, something happened where a British woman named Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had smallpox, she had smallpox, and her face was badly scarred from the smallpox. She was worried because she had kids, and she didn't want her kids to die of smallpox. She was very, very worried about it. And her husband was an ambassador in England and was sent to Turkey. So Lady Mary went to Turkey with her husband, and she noticed that people there were not really worried about smallpox very much. And she asked, she said, don't you have smallpox around here? Why not? And the people in Turkey said, oh, the old Christian ladies came by with the walnut. And Lady Mary was thinking, what are you talking about? Old Christian ladies with a walnut? And she started to ask around, and she figured out that there were some ladies, I think they came from Greece, and they knew through tradition that you could take a walnut, and when you break a walnut shell, it's very sharp. And so they took a walnut shell, and they knew that they could scrape pus from somebody that had smallpox and scrape it into the arm of somebody that never had smallpox. And what would happen is that the person that got scraped would get a very mild case of smallpox and then never get smallpox ever again the rest of their life, and consequently never die of it. And so she thought, that sounds really strange, and I don't want my son to die. So let's try it on my 5-year-old son in Turkey. So she had an old Christian lady with the walnut scrape pus into her 5-year-old son's arm. And lo and behold, he got a mild case of smallpox, recovered, never had smallpox again the rest of his life. So she thought, I've got to tell these people in England about this. This could save a lot of people. And so she went to England, and she got, because she was well connected, she got the most prestigious doctors in England to watch her 4-year-old daughter get scraped with, the walnut pus. You know what I mean? They scraped pus from somebody that had smallpox and scraped it into her arm in front of maybe 50 physicians, the top physicians in England, with them all watching. And lo and behold, same thing. Mild case of smallpox, recovered completely, never got smallpox the rest of her life. Then the Princess of England heard about this, and she thought, I don't want the royal family to die of smallpox. What about my kids? I don't want them to die, but I'm not sure if this crazy scraping pus into somebody's arm really works. It sounds too crazy. So let's try it out. Let's get some condemned prisoners and try it out on them. So they took condemned prisoners, they scraped pus into their arms, same thing. Mild case of smallpox, recovered, never got smallpox the rest of her lives. So the princess thought, wow, this might actually work. But first, let's try it on some orphans. So they got orphans out of the orphanage, and they scraped pus into their arms, and lo and behold, same thing. Mild case, protected from smallpox. So then the Princess of England had her royal children vaccinated, which they called engraftment at that time. So people have known a lot about how vaccines can save lives. People have known a lot about it for a long time. Now all vaccines are not equal in terms of their safety and efficacy. And I think people should take in as much information as they can about every vaccine. I'm often asked about the COVID vaccine and, whether or not I believe the COVID vaccine itself can be damaging. And what I would tell people is that the vaccine itself is a single protein, the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So when you get the COVID vaccine, you are getting a viral protein inside of our bodies. When you get a natural infection, you're getting about 28 different viral proteins inside of our bodies. Now, so now let's talk about the spike protein itself, and let's talk about some of the details about it and why it might cause unwanted effects. So the spike protein, remember the spike protein binds to a specific protein called ACE2. That's the way it attaches to cells to get into cells. It binds this protein called ACE2. And ACE2 is expressed predominantly in the heart, the gut, and in some places in the lung. So in other words, when we have the spike protein inside of our bodies, it's going to bind to wherever that ACE2 protein is located. And so that means that the spike protein is going to bind to ACE2 on the heart. You know what I mean? And people may have heard about myocarditis, inflammation of the heart, that has been suspected to be the result of either a natural SARS-CoV-2 infection or vaccination. And the point that I'm trying to deliver to you is that it makes sense that there could be problems that result from the spike protein binding to ACE2 on the heart, because the spike protein itself has clumping properties. It has aggregation properties. The spike protein is a very large protein. It's much larger than the average size protein. And there are certain parts of the protein that we now know have the tendency to like collapse and clump together. And when that happens inside of our body, that causes inflammation. So what I'm trying to tell you is that people that have myocarditis following a natural infection or a vaccination, this might be a problem that's related to the spike protein binding to ACE2 in the heart, causing aggregation and inflammation. Inflammation of the heart is myocarditis.
Is there a difference, in your opinion, in the type of myocarditis that may be caused in the aftermath of taking a COVID vaccine versus the aftermath of a COVID infection?
That's an excellent question. I'll tell you this. If you ask about the frequency, how often do you see myocarditis following vaccination compared to how often do you see myocarditis following a natural infection? It depends on whether or not the person was previously vaccinated. So if a person was previously vaccinated, there is a certain frequency of myocarditis. For people that were not vaccinated and subsequently had a natural infection, my understanding from the literature is that the frequency is roughly 10 to 30 times higher. So in other words, you're much more likely to have myocarditis following a natural infection if you haven't been vaccinated compared to if you have been vaccinated. So that would suggest that the answer to your question is the natural infection, with all those 28 different proteins, that does indeed raise the risk of myocarditis.
Dr. Ostrov, admittedly, I haven't had a chance to dive into the research, given everything else going on in the world.
That's okay. There's so much.
There's so much.
There's so much.
But I wanted to ask you, there's we're on, whatever booster number related to the COVID vaccine, and people who have gotten vaccinated, some people still get sick, right? Like people, you get vaccinated, you can still get the infection. Where I get a little confused is what happens to those statistics, given that, some people may not, it's not preventing an infection in those who are vaccinated. So what does that do to risks in terms of this spike protein binding to different places in your heart and whatnot? Do we know, or like just, or
That's
even from an immunologist perspective here, like what could possibly be happening?
so let me see if I understand your question. It sounds like it seems like since the virus is killing less people now, it's more difficult to understand precisely how effective a vaccine is, right? That's kind of your question, right?
I think so. Or
And
contribution to side effects, infection versus vaccine. A lot of people have both, right?
yes,
Okay, so that's
yes,
kind of the basis of my question. Sorry, I didn't phrase it properly
that's
before.
okay.
um, but that's where I get sort of confused. Like, what is happening? Or what?
Because really your underlying question is, should I get vaccinated, right? Like, should you get another booster? That's
Sure.
really the underlying question, right? Like a lot of people are interested in this question, including me. And I will, my answer is, that's a personal decision. But for me personally, I don't feel an intense need for a booster, a COVID booster at this time, nor do I feel that my family needs a booster at this time. And the main reason is because when we were vaccinated with COVID, remember the army, remember the military and how the immune system is like a military force. And there's the general of the army, the helper T cells. Well, when we were vaccinated with COVID, or if you received a natural infection and were unvaccinated, your immune system was exposed to pieces of the virus. And the generals of the army now recognize those pieces of the virus. And those generals of the army can last a very long time in our bodies, maybe even throughout our entire lifetime. Nobody knows, really. You might know that when you get a tetanus shot, for example, it's thought to last for a long time. When you get the measles vaccine, it's thought to last for, a long time. And so when we received our COVID vaccines, or if you got a natural infection and never had a COVID vaccine, you likely have memory helper T cells inside your body right now, and they might live for your entire life.
Okay, so
Now,
now go ahead.
so that being said, I want to. That's one reason why I'm not intensely focused on getting a new booster. Another reason is that the virus itself is getting less deadly. You might remember that early in the pandemic, the mortality of SARS-CoV-2 was about 1 in 100. If you didn't count, certain factors that would make people at higher risk. Just on average, it would kill about 1 in 100 people if you were infected. Now, what are the statistics? It's something like flu. It's more like 1 in 10,000, 1 in 20,000. And the people that do succumb are more often, elderly or obese or compromised in some manner. And so what does that mean? Does this mean that all of our immune systems are now protecting us better, or has the virus actually gotten less deadly? This is a very important question. And to my way of thinking, the answer is quite clear. And the answer is, it's probably a combination of the both, but one plays a much more significant role than the other. The virus has gotten much less deadly than it used to be. True, our immune systems may have been boosted because of vaccination and natural infection, but the virus itself is less deadly. And I say it's quite clear because when you take the virus, like the original Wuhan strain, and you put it, let's say, in a mouse, it will kill the mice in 5 days. You take the virus that exists now, the Omicron variants, and you put it in the same mice, and they'll live forever. Or, well, they'll live for as long as a mouse will live. So clearly, the virus has changed to become less deadly, less pathogenic. So that's my answer. Those are my thoughts. I
appreciate it.
I don't think we should worry now. But I would like to caution people about the cyclical nature of virus outbreaks. So measles, for example, we've heard about measles on the news recently.
Sure.
And people might not be aware that measles is one of these viruses that comes and goes in a cyclical pattern about every 7 years. Now, SARS-CoV-2, what about it? What about COVID? Should we forget about COVID? I think not, because SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus, and there have been very deadly coronavirus outbreaks roughly every 7 to 10 years for the past 20 years or so. In 2002 to 2004, there was SARS in China, it killed about 10 to 30% of the people it infected, it killed. SARS seemed to go away mysteriously without any vaccine or specific antiviral drug. It's kind of a mystery. Then MERS came. So SARS came, and then MERS came 2012. It was even more deadly. It killed roughly 70% of the people that it infected. Middle Eastern respiratory virus, MERS.
Right.
That one has declined. It's not gone away completely, but it also has gone down. And then SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19. So I think it's realistic to expect that there will be a new deadly coronavirus outbreak, perhaps SARS-CoV-3, probably in 5 to 10 years. So at that time, maybe at that time, we will need a brand new vaccine strategy, completely different than the vaccines that we have today, focused on SARS-CoV-3 spike protein. Now, our work is really aimed at all coronaviruses. You know what I mean? We're thinking about we're not only thinking about long COVID patients and prevention and treatment of COVID for now, we're thinking about the next deadly outbreak that's likely to happen in 5 to 10 years. And we believe that our antiviral drug combination will be helpful globally in terms of prevention and treatment of future COVID.
It would probably be easy to scale up too, based on how you describe it, which is so important during a pandemic. And we certainly saw the shortcomings there on a global level when addressing COVID. I wanted to take it back a little bit to a little more general discussion about vaccines. Of course, you were just mentioning when someone has a COVID infection and then, they produce this T cell response. And I think a lot of people have heard the words natural immunity. A better term might be naturally acquired immunity, because you have to fight off an infection, right? You're not just born with it. You have to fight something to get it. I guess that's where the word acquired comes in. Can you explain, and also measles has been in the news, as you said, and, we could talk about any disease here, but what happens when you're not vaccinated? And perhaps you can talk about this maybe using different types of diseases, COVID, measles, rabies, even, just to kind of give people an idea of what they should be thinking about or considering.
Well, the short answer is that your symptoms will be worse. Regardless of what the infectious agent is. Let's say if you were to get flu, if you had a flu vaccine, your symptoms would be less than if you did not have a flu vaccine. And the same is true for measles. The same is true for COVID. And really, it has to do with the time that it takes for your body to respond. and also interference of the immune response by the infectious agent. For example, viruses have figured out numerous ways to inhibit the immune response by interfering with different protein-protein interactions. The viruses will make like a decoy protein so that the normal proteins of your immune system won't be able to interact with each other properly. So if you're not vaccinated and your immune system is not like ready to go and kill the virus is going to start producing its own proteins and slow down your immune system even more.
Follow up to that, there are a lot of people concerned about side effects of vaccines, a lot of people concerned about vaccine schedules. Am I getting too many vaccines? Is there such a thing as too many vaccines? As an immunologist, based on your research and experience, what would you say to a person who has those concerns?
Information is the best guide. And so you might, so people should be aware of the commonly administered vaccines and the schedules that are typically administered. And if they have concerns, they should talk to their physicians about it. Sometimes there is a history of disease in a family where they might be particularly worried. So let's say there's a family that had diabetes, insulin-dependent diabetes in the family, and they had heard that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine could somehow influence the onset of insulin-dependent diabetes. They might want to ask their doctor if they should delay getting the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine for a few years. You know what I mean? So I think information is the best guide. And I would encourage people, if they're curious, to talk to multiple people to ask their opinions. And people should feel free to reach out to me because I will be glad to offer thoughts and guidance to people more knowledgeable than me.
Well, that's nice. I'll be sure to include your email. You'll probably get an onslaught of messages. You might regret saying that, Dr. Ostrov.
Well, we can,
we could do a town hall, maybe have people ask questions.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
That's a smart idea. Okay, that's why you're an immunologist and I'm not.
No.
I just wanted to talk, since you're in Florida, Florida was in the news recently with measles. Of course, measles is in other states. What are your thoughts about the measles outbreak right now? And if people are worried, what should they do?
Well, it's very concerning, especially to the relatives of the kids that go to the schools where measles has been found. I guess if my children were in a school where there were unvaccinated children, and some of them and I didn't know like which ones were vaccinated and which ones weren't, but I knew that all of a sudden measles appeared in my public school, I would not want my student, my son or daughter, to be at that public school. That's my personal decision. I don't want them being around like if you think about a herd, think about ranchers that have livestock, cattle or pigs. You ask them if they vaccinate their herds. Most of them do. Most ranchers vaccinate their herds. Why? Because they value the lives of their livestock, and they don't want a sick herd. And I don't want my kids to be sick. And I don't want my kids to pass on measles to their grandparents. So these are some of my personal opinions. My opinion is, just basically, if you're concerned about the measles vaccine, you might want to ask why. Is it specifically the measles vaccine that there's something about it that you are hesitant about that? If there is, I'd love to know what that is. Because, maybe we can talk about it. Maybe we can talk about vaccines that you think are okay and vaccines that you think are not, and we can talk about what they are and what the differences are.
Yeah.
I
That's a
don't
good
really
idea.
see a gigantic difference between the measles vaccine and other vaccines. So
Okay.
I don't see why somebody would be much more reluctant to take it. Um,
Well, I
but
think also there is some people have the view that measles is a mild infection and you get it and you recover. What would you say to a person who has that thought?
this is true for people that are not immunocompromised. But sometimes you can't tell when people are immunocompromised. And you can only tell when there's a bad effect. Like if the measles has a horrible effect in somebody. You know what I mean? And so that's what I would say to somebody who thinks, oh, this is just going to be mild. I'll be able to fight it off. I don't need this vaccine. That might be true. That might not be true. You always have to ask yourself, what's the risk? What's the benefit? Does the benefit outweigh the risk? Only you can decide. But it's good to talk with people when you make that decision.
Right. And I think so to frame the conversation is certainly think about risks and benefits when you're considering a vaccine, get as much information as you can from people such as yourself, but also consider the risks and benefits of the virus itself that you're up against. And because that,
Exactly.
right. So I think that's a great way to frame that conversation. So folks, it's not just about the vaccine, but it's about the virus too, when you think risks and benefits.
Exactly.
So let's jump into the mRNA vaccines versus the adeno-associated viral vector vaccines. Both were deployed during COVID. I think the J&J vaccine was the adeno-associated viral vector vaccine.
Yes.
Maybe first, can you just give a quick overview of both of those for folks? And that'll be a great segue to my next question.
Yes. Yes. So just to give you a little bit of background, the adeno-associated viruses are have historically been developed for gene therapy. So people have been using these types of viruses to force expression of proteins to help people. So for example, if you're lacking an enzyme that allows you to see, people are forcing expression of the protein that they're missing in the eye, and then lo and behold, people can see. You know what I mean? That's like an example of how this gene therapy strategy works. And it's supposed to be a long lasting. You're supposed to be able to inject the adeno-associated virus and get long expression of whatever protein it is that you're trying to express. So people thought, all right, let's make a COVID vaccine. We'll force expression of the spike protein. And then we'll put it in people, and that will provoke an immune response against the spike protein. Now let's talk about mRNA. mRNA is a strategy where a lot of people have been working on it, especially in the cancer area, trying to make cancer vaccines. And what people have done here at the University of Florida and elsewhere is to take cancers and extract the RNA from the cancer and then put it into a nanoparticle. So they'll take the mRNA from the cancer, they'll put it in a nanoparticle, and they will inject it into the cancer patient to provoke an immune response against the cancer. So that is a rapidly developing technology that was rushed forward during COVID. And the mRNA vaccine strategy, they basically, they took mRNA, they encapsulated it with basically lipid, it's like a fat droplet with mRNA on the inside. And that was injected into people to provoke an immune response against the spike protein. And so in terms of the differences, the mRNA, you get expression of the spike protein for 7 to 14 days. So the protein's only being expressed in your body for about 7 to 14 days. For the adeno-associated virus, when you get injected with it, the protein expression is supposed to last much longer. Now, what about the safety and efficacy? of mRNA versus adeno-associated virus. You might remember that the efficacy of the mRNA vaccines were higher than the AAV. And you might also remember that the side effects of AAV were worse than mRNA. To me, this is very, very important because it means that the mRNA strategy, we now know it has been injected into so many people around the world with a good safety profile that the mRNA strategy, I believe, is going to revolutionize medicine. And it is perhaps going to overtake the AAV, which was not as effective and not as safe compared to the mRNA technology, at least with respect to COVID. So my expectation actually is that the world of medicine is going to change, that we are going to be seeing many more vaccine strategies that rely on mRNA, for example, to vaccinate people against cancer, to vaccinate people against Alzheimer's disease, to vaccinate people against Parkinson's disease. Maybe there will be a vaccine to prevent type 1 diabetes. To my way of thinking, mRNA has a very strong chance of changing the world of biomedicine.
Wow, that's a big statement. But I mean, I think if you can use such a technology to stop cancer and some of these neurodegenerative diseases that cripple people, kill people, that's exciting. That's exciting if you can maintain that safety profile. So there might be some good things in the field of medicine in the future.
Yes,
Hopefully.
I think, yeah, just in general, things seem to be getting much better. In the cancer world,
yeah,
imaging has dramatically changed outcomes for cancer patients. You know, we can see things that we couldn't see before, and that allows us to intervene.
Of course, they're in the news lately, and a lot of folks are talking about this, is the early onset cancers. They're seeing an uptick in those in people under the age of 50. That's concerning to a lot of people, and they're trying to figure out what's causing that. Like, you know, the colon cancer rates. Yeah,
yes,
that's
very interesting.
It is, and very concerning.
My guess is we're going to find out soon.
Really?
More about, yeah, my guess. Like there's so many tools now that we have to be able to ask and answer questions about specific types of cancer. You know, trying to figure out exactly which genes were mutated, which pathways are affected, often offering clues on the best treatment strategies.
Sure. And I just want to be clear when I say this, I know this is in the news now, but this trend has been happening for decades in people under 50. And now it's sort of just getting a lot of attention, this early onset cancer. All right. Do you have time for a few more questions?
Sure.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, it's great speaking with you.
Okay. Well,
we can talk all day.
I wish that was the case for me. So let's go back to COVID-19. We're out of the weeds, you know, people are back to normal, so to speak. There's been a lot of criticism over the public health response, you know, at the population level. If we were to do an after-action review here, what are some things that could have been done differently? Or maybe what did we get wrong or we missed that we should get right for a future pandemic? Do you have any thoughts on that? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but since you're here.
No, I have lots of thoughts.
Okay, good.
Well, I guess I would say, you know, I am, you know, I'm an employee of the University of Florida. And so, you know, I need to respect our, you know, health science communications people. And, you know, I want to make sure that, you know, I don't say anything that I'm not supposed to. But my personal opinion is that in Florida, I thought we did a lot right. I thought that, you know, as somebody who was living here with kids, I thought that businesses and schools were closed down at appropriate times when the danger level was the highest. You know what I mean? In the beginning, we didn't remember in the very beginning, we didn't even think that that it could be transmitted by air. Remember? And then once we realized that it could be transmitted by air, that changed everything. Then we were wearing masks, things were shut down, essential businesses only were opened. And here in Florida, I thought it seemed appropriate to me at the time. I didn't think that the closures were too much or too little. And I think things started to open up at the right time. I guess those are my main thoughts in terms of like messaging, you know, perhaps, you know, the messaging, I think, you know, some might say the messaging was not completely consistent for, you know, different states, you know, saying what to do. And I think, you know, it was hard because people, you know, there was such a flow of information. It was such like an overwhelming situation where more information was coming out every day. People couldn't absorb it. And leaders in the field were not really able to communicate through the mainstream media to let people know what was happening in real time. And in many ways, I felt privileged at that time because I was in communication with the leaders in the field around the world. So I guess those are my main thoughts. Like, so what should we do next time differently compared to what was done this time? I think that COVID taught us a lot about vigilance by looking at wastewater. You know what I mean? Like we had not, like before COVID, I don't think there was nearly as much scrutiny of wastewater and the presence of viruses in it. And so my guess is that in the future, we're going to have more alarm bells that go off. So the next, remember, in 5 to 10 years, in my opinion, there's very likely to be a deadly new coronavirus outbreak, you know, perhaps SARS-CoV-3. And my guess is that the alarm bells will be ringing long before the, you know, it would have been if we didn't have these warning systems in place. You know, and once that happens, then, you know, I think society is more geared up to be prepared about what needs to happen next. You know, if we understand the sequence of a deadly new virus, we can immediately start to develop antiviral drugs against it, and we can immediately start to develop a new vaccine strategy. So my guess is that you know, based on what happened before, that's what's going to happen next time this does happen.
I also think as we modernize our data systems, you know, we get data in faster we can make faster decisions. And if we invest, kind of have a constant investment in resources and the infrastructure to handle or address a pandemic versus flooding, you know, resources and funding, you know, right when an emergency is about to hit. I think that's key to be prepared for the next pandemic. And the messaging, I appreciate what you said about the messaging. And I think a big criticism was that the messaging wasn't nuanced enough. It wasn't tailored or targeted to specific populations because the message probably isn't the same for a person who's high risk versus a person who's low risk. But I think when you're doing these population level interventions, you try to simplify, right? Because you just throw out a general message and you're trying to keep it simple. And then when you try to keep something so simple, it can lose its accuracy to some extent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I think we can become sophisticated enough where we can deliver messages of uncertainty when uncertainty is the right message. You know, not necessarily attach ourselves to an answer. Oh, this is it. You know, after this, we're done. Because I think that really affects people emotionally, you know, because people, you know, were inside, they were missing out on school activities, work, lost jobs, lost wages, which is really also part of this pandemic. And so
Yes.
that's, I think we can get there, but
Yeah. Yeah, if I can offer some thoughts on this,
Yes, please.
I think what we're missing is a rapid response force for emerging pathogens. Um, if we think about what happened before during COVID, we can think about, Johnson and Johnson and AstraZeneca and Pfizer and Moderna. These are drug companies, and they have their expertise in certain techniques. They could do certain things fast. But I we have to think about the motivation also. You know what I mean? Like any company, the primary goal is profit. It's not improving human health. Um, in academics, this is different. Our mission here is to improve human health through research and teaching. And so what I would like, what I'm aiming for, and what I would encourage investors and philanthropists to think about is to join our mission to try and have an academic industry partnership where we can do things fast here as an emerging pathogen comes into focus. And this is a lesson that I was taught during COVID. Like early in COVID, very early, people started to contact me asking if any of the drug candidates that we published on in 2011 would be effective against SARS-CoV-2. And we here at the University of Florida have biosafety level 3 labs, and we immediately tested these drugs, and they actually did exert direct antiviral activity against SARS-CoV-2. My point is that in academics, we can do things fast because things are set up that way. We can do things fast and safe and less expensively in many cases than a drug company. And so my hope is that we can have an academic industry partnership where we at the University of Florida are helping improve health in a manner that not only helps the patient, but helps the company. That because, we're aware that it takes money to bring drugs to people, and there has to be money made, otherwise this will not happen. And so we have, a mentality and a strategy to make this happen. And our strategy is to generate intellectual property, because we know that intellectual property can drive clinical activities. So I would encourage investors and philanthropists that want to be involved in an academic industry partnership to contact me, and let's put our heads together and try and move drugs into the clinic and, have the businesses benefit as well.
I like that idea. And taking it back to your comment on motivation, I think there is a lot of distrust out there because people feel that, corporations, industry, as you said, their primary motivation is profit. Their primary loyalty is to their shareholders. And
Yes.
this brings me to this question of information, the flow of information. A lot of people, when they read something online, they're like, well, who funded the study? Right. And if it's industry, oh, I don't trust it. If it's perhaps someone that they trust, someone they listen to, someone who they, I don't know,
I hear
trust in
you.
general. Yeah. They'll like, oh, I'll listen to that. And, and there, even during this response, there was a lot of attempts to control the flow of information and allow certain sources to speak and certain sources not to speak, which I think fundamentally backfires in a democratic society, and probably down the road fuels more distrust. And I think it's also dangerous when you have, industry with such influence over information, health information here. And we saw that with the tobacco industry, right? When the government actually was starting to come up with, hey guys, secondhand smoke is actually more dangerous than we thought. It leads to cancer. Here's our evidence, right? In the tobacco industry, they went out and they hired a PR company And they tried to say, no, no, that's junk science. And in fact, that term junk science comes from the tobacco industry trying to downplay secondhand smoke. Yeah. And so I always remember that story because extremely powerful industry that had a lot of control and politicians in their back pocket and scientists in their back pocket. So I guess, how does someone navigate this environment that we have today? I struggle with it too, by the way,
I hear you.
Yeah.
So it's very important to consider the source of information. Now, let's talk for a minute about social media. If you're getting your information from social media, you have to appreciate that it's a mixture of accurate information and inaccurate information. Remember, social media is really entertainment. You know what I mean? People use social media for entertainment. If you're getting your news from social media, you might want to look around a little bit and look at other sources of information to see if they're consistent with what you're reading. And so I would encourage people, if you want to get health information, first of all, don't look on social media to get it. The best place to get information, accurate information about biomedical science, is from high impact journals. So you might know that scientific journals are basically graded based on their impact. There's an actual number that is assigned to individual journals called the impact factor. And this impact factor it actually is calculated based on how many times the journal is cited as a reference by other journals. You know what I mean? And basically, the higher the number, the more impactful it is, and the more prestigious it is, the more difficult it is to publish, the more leaders in the field that are reviewing the papers. So I would encourage people that are interested in biomedical information to look at high impact journals. Now, if you're not a scientist, how can you read and understand a high impact journal article? Because usually they're extremely dense and complicated. So, how can you understand that? Well, there are actually some websites that kind of decode them. They decode the high impact articles, and I can refer people to such resources if they're interested. But at least my general approach is to pay attention to the source. If you read something on social media, and you read what the source is it actually being described? You know what I mean? Like if you read an article on Facebook and they say that it came from the journal Nature, did it really come from the journal Nature, or is that somebody trying to manipulate you? I don't know the answer to that question. But if you go to the journal Nature, you will see what's actually been vetted.
So maybe just take a pause before you jump on whatever you read and look a little deeper, ask some more questions about the source, see where the information comes from.
Well, yes. And just think about like the news.
Yeah.
When you watch, if you want to understand what's really happening, you know what I mean? You will probably want to be a channel flipper. You know what I mean? And see what's happening on your local news. See if that's the same thing that's happening on the major news networks. See what's happening on BBC. See what's happening on the European news. You know what I mean? You should change channels just like normal and see what people are talking about. And you will get a sense of what the truth is. And you will see how sometimes some people exaggerate one thing or another. You know what I mean? So I would encourage people to be a channel flipper and do the same with their internet resources.
I think everyone can relate to how fast a rumor can spread, right? If they went through high school.
Yes.
Or if you were a victim of a rumor in high school, and then by the time you heard it, whoa.
Yeah. What's that Mark Twain quote? Like, I forgot.
I can't remember. I've been reading a lot of Mark Twain quotes lately too. I wanted to, about the journals, are you at all worried that the industry has too much power over the journals now? Or is that not a concern of yours?
I would say the short answer is it's not a concern
It's not a,
because
okay.
let me put it this way. Um, Companies, large pharmaceutical companies, are very tight-lipped. They don't want to reveal their secrets. They often, when they want to publish something, they'll often make a press release and brag about something without showing the data. Um, if a if on the other hand, sometimes large pharmaceutical companies will purposefully want to publish in the highest caliber of journal so that they can get that respect. They'll want to publish in New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet showing the efficacy of their COVID vaccine. You know what I mean? So if now, am I worried that that Pfizer influences the editorial board of the New England Journal of Medicine? Not really. I think that at these high impact journals, the editors are the leaders in the field and they can't be sold. I don't think it is. I'm not concerned that high impact journals are being misled in any way by biotech companies. There are very strict standards for these high impact journals. The data needs to be validated in a number of important ways. So I'm not worried.
All right, you're not concerned. You guys heard it from Dr. Ostrov. This was great. Thank you so much for joining in for this podcast here. And if you're up for it, perhaps we can do, more of sort of like a participation podcast where folks can write in questions and we could do a live thing and you could answer
That
them.
would be great. I'm
Awesome.
happy to.
You're great, Dr. Ostrov.
You're great, Dr. Aaron. So great to see you.
Great to see you too. And thank you to everybody who joined in. I hope you subscribe and join us next time. All right.
Excellent. Have a great day.